So for this next unit, I'm going to try to go pretty quickly and just kind of give you verbally tell you the high spots because you can kind of read what's on the slides. Um, One of the things so we talked yesterday, right, in week one about what's taking place as far as industrialization, mass production. You have lots of immigration coming in, lots of things. So the U.S. is producing, producing, producing. And that means we have lots of products. And it's into this environment that the US, which is kind of, especially after the Civil War, where it's able to really focus on economic growth, really begins to see itself as kind of, maybe we should be on the world stage, right? So some of the isolationism that had existed, prior to the Civil War seems to have gone away. So, causes of imperialism, global competition, competition with Britain, competition with other countries, the need for markets, all that kind of stuff. And then, of course, the impact of the closing frontier creates some anxiety. And we talked about kind of this national identity, this nativism that we saw kind of bubbling up, right? The social Darwinism that says we're superior. And so all of these things begin to kind of shape the American mindset, right? And then again, you've got tensions with workers, you've got tensions with farmers who are needing, who are trying to compete in this increasingly globalized economy. So I think you have really what we would consider now as like the first kind of wave of globalization. And so you're going to have the United States and other countries, it's not just the United States, looking at how can we exert our influence. Now, the problem with that's often kind of economic and political domination, usually not very culturally sensitive. But in the late 1800s, I don't know, like when you think about the environment of social Darwinism, most people are going to ascribe to that. So it's tempting to want to judge the people in the past for having those attitudes, but at the same time, and we can certainly understand the negative consequences of those and kind of recognize why we don't want to think that way anymore. But at the time, this is something that was very common among, European and the descendants, the countries that came from European powers like the United States. And so again, you have this whole idea of the U.S. Beginning to accept this idea of world power, and that this Puck cartoon right here kind of shows you kind of what they're talking about, the U.S. putting on a warship and kind of, being kind of dressed for war, that this is something they're going to go do. It's a choice, right? It's not just that we're stumbling into it. The U.S. is deciding to do this. And the closing frontier, of course, is a big driving factor. And there's a couple of places you want to know about Japan. We start engaging with Japan in 1850s, and they begin to kind of rapidly industrialize. This is going to create some concern about Japanese influence in Asia and that kind of thing. You're going to have the purchase of Alaska. China, you're going to have this idea of the open door policy, that China has to be kept open. So kind of ironic that we throw up the Chinese Exclusion Act. We say we don't want any more Chinese coming in, but we can come trade with you all that we want. And so you have the U.S. kind of engaging in that global trade, and this makes Hawaii particularly attractive. Now, Hawaii had been some early missionaries had come in. These missionaries had, kind of started to convert people. You had a monarchy in Hawaii, and essentially what's going to happen is, these missionaries will attract planters who are growing sugar and, getting pineapple, and these plantations will become incredibly powerful, and they will want to they start advocating for annexation of Hawaii in order to protect themselves from tariffs. And ultimately, what will happen will be that they'll overthrow the queen, and there's a whole backstory to that. So hopefully you'll get a chance to look at the Queen Liliuokalani bio that someone's doing. So that'll be kind of interesting as well. So that you have the U.S. being engaged in kind of that Asian area. Now, another reason for imperialism is going to be Mahan's naval theory. Mahan's naval theory suggests, Mahan's naval theory suggests that that strong countries have strong trade, and strong trade requires a strong navy. And so, in other words, it's really an economic and geopolitical theory that says if we want to be important, we have to have a good navy, and we have to be able to dominate the seas. Well, if you're going to have a navy in the 1890s, you have to have naval bases because the technology isn't there for you to sail, all around the world without having to refuel. So this increases the need for the U.S. to have Hawaii as a naval base, and for the U.S. to be interested in acquiring other places because they want to be that economic power. Remember, we're producing all this stuff, right? So we need to find a way to have markets. We want to be sure we're getting all the raw materials that we need, and then of course you throw into that kind of the Christian missionaries that want to convert people. You throw into that social Darwinism and the white supremacy, the Anglo-Saxonism that says that American culture, white culture, Anglo-American culture is superior to what exists in Hawaii, is superior to what exists in Mexico, that kind of thing. And so that idea is very much there. So it's into this context that you have the Spanish-American War. Spanish-American War is significant because the U.S. basically kicks the butt of Spain, and it's a European power. It's this old empire. And Spain had the last place they really had was Cuba. And so they were really reluctant to let go of that. But there had been, and this is something that you need to remember for World War I, is that a lot of these countries, whether it's Cuba, whether it's the Philippines, whether it's Bosnia, whether it's Croatia, Serbia, all those places that were part of larger empires, these old empires, Spanish Empire, Austria-Hungarian Empire, German Empire, that kind of thing, French Empire even, that those places wanted to be independent. They were tired of having that imperial control. And so they're having these independence movements, and pretty much what's happening is around the globe, every major European power is pushing down these independence movements, refusing to give people, their freedom and independence. And depending on the circumstance, sometimes it was really just kind of economic and political domination. Sometimes in the case of Cuba, what you're talking about are concentration camps. And you're talking about putting people in these camps, women being, raped and killed, and children going hungry, and all the terrible things that we think of when we think of a concentration camp. And Spain was not the only country doing that. You could argue that the American reservation system for Native Americans was a variation of this. In fact, there's some suggestion that the concept of a concentration camp comes from our idea of a reservation. You certainly had it happening pretty heavily in Africa. And so this idea that Spain is somehow exceptional in their brutality is really not accurate. But what matters is that journalism convinces the American public that they are being exceptional. And so you have this yellow journalism concept. So this notion of fake news and exaggerated headlines, not new to 2019. It was absolutely a driving factor in why the U.S. was prepared and ready and eager even to go to war. So the U.S. had invested heavily in Cuba because of its proximity to Florida. And so you have lots of money, American money tied up there while they're having this independence movement, this revolution. And it's just kind of creating some problems, right? And so McKinley, who's getting a lot of pressure to do something, sends the USS Maine into Havana in order to protect American interests and keep an eye on things. And the ship blows up. Okay. And blows up on accident. It was, just simply not storing the ammunition in the right place. But nobody realizes that. We don't really discover that until the 1970s. So this explosion of the USS Maine causes American newspapers to call for war. Remember, the Maine becomes a big thing. Teddy Roosevelt, who was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, he had a really good relationship with the press. So he was one of those. He was your Lindsey Graham, always showing up and talking to people. And anyways, he basically says, we have to go to war. McKinley has to do this. And he essentially resigns his post as Secretary of the Navy, creates the Rough Riders. and goes off to fight there. And so you have basically, finally, you get an approval from Congress to go to war with Spain. Or actually, what they do is they say, we want Cuba to be independent, right? So there's just enough people there that are concerned about, sugar coming from Cuba, creating too much product, driving prices down. There's some people that oppose us going in and taking over Cuba from Spain. Like, it's kind of hard when you've been arguing that Spain is being brutal and awful for us to then go in and take over and ignore the independence movement. And so basically they passed this Teller Amendment that says, you can't, we're going to fight for Cuban independence, and we're going to help, kind of keep order in our neighborhood. And so this is how you end up with us going into the war. And you can see these cartoons right here, the goddess of liberty, freeing Cuba, right? Bringing peace, this kind of idea that this is what, that we're doing something really, really great here. And you can see, there's Roosevelt and the Rough Riders, this notion about the yellow journalism, all that kind of stuff. So the results of the Spanish-American War are that it's over pretty quickly, within about really 4 to 6 months. Treaty of Paris is 6 months after it starts, basically gives Cuba its independence, but America is going to really kind of oversee and control Cuba. We're going to have a Platt Amendment that essentially says, we get to tell you what to do, we get to control your debts. So they're independent, but they're not really independent. And the U.S. purchases from Spain the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico. And then in the process of doing that, we finally annex Hawaii. So you have the U.S. really kind of getting these places, these islands, that if you look at it on a map, really just kind of gives them a nice way to kind of hop all around the globe, right? So it's great since the United States has kind of bought into this Mahan's naval theory, right? Now, one of the problems is that the Philippines had an independence movement. Initially, the Filipinos think that the U.S. is going to give them independence like they did Cuba, and they get pretty upset when they find out that's not happening. So then you have the Filipinos pushing back and fighting against the Americans from about 1899 to about 1902, 1903. So you really have insurgency, right? We would call them terrorist attacks, guerrilla warfare, lots of things like that, very similar to what we'll experience in Vietnam. And so you have lots of fighting in the Philippines. It takes us a while to get over that. And in fact, the annexation of the Philippines is pretty controversial in the United States. You have a lot of anti-imperialists, many of whom are women, that say this is not what we're about, right? And so the U.S. definitely kind of engages in this imperialism, uses this total control. And so you have kind of this assumption that we have to teach these other countries how to be civilized, how to do this stuff. So a lot of kind of racist ideas kind of tangled up with that. And of course, Roosevelt and Taft will eventually become presidents. This cartoon showing the U.S. kind of surprise, surprise. Now we've got these territories we have to take care of. And this particular cartoon, which is actually in your American Yop Reader, is a really good one. I strongly encourage you to go take a look at it. You can see you've got Hawaii, the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico in the front being schooled. You've got, I believe, other American states in the back, American citizens, Chinese, not even allowed in, Native American with the book upside down, and the African American cleaning the window. So lots of racist messages in that particular cartoon, but this really kind of embodies what the U.S. saw itself as doing. The other part of imperialism has to do with Latin America. Again, once we start to have, after the Spanish-American War, and we have all these territories in the Atlantic and the Pacific, the fact that you have to sail around the tip of South America is really inconvenient. So there had been, from Britain and France, attempts to build a canal across Panama. And so this idea of doing that had been around for a while. Teddy Roosevelt goes to Colombia and he's like, hey, we really want to build this canal. Well, Colombia doesn't trust Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt has come out with this Roosevelt corollary, which basically says the U.S. is kind of the policeman of the Western Hemisphere, that if there's any instability, any uprisings or whatever, the U.S. is going to go take care of it, right? So there's kind of this this real threat kind of with the Roosevelt corollary that we're going to intervene, as well as spending a lot of money in other countries. And, spending money and being invested in other countries is how we got involved in Cuba. So Colombia says no, and then Roosevelt essentially sends a warship down to Panama, encourages a Panamanian revolution, and so you end up with an independent Panama, and part of that arrangement is that we get to construct the canal across there. And then you also have the notion of dollar diplomacy. This is particularly Taft's idea. William Howard Taft decides that what the U.S. needs to do is invest heavily in the country, in these Latin American countries, rather than use military force. So he kind of softens the stance on the Roosevelt corollary. But again, the problem is that economic investment, we know some of the problems that workers and immigrants were having. So imagine that those problems taking place in countries that don't have, that are either recently independent or have always been kind of tied up in that colonial economy where they only make raw materials. So the American investment actually opens up a lot of complicated factors, but that is definitely kind of the trend you see in Latin America. So you see the U.S. becoming more and more invested in what's happening there. And you can see, like, this cartoon right here shows Taft patting Roosevelt's big stick policy, right? That's what dollar diplomacy is supposed to do. Roosevelt walks off with a carry big stick, Panama Canal. The U.S., putting on that idea of imperialism. So key concepts about it, it has to do with industrialization and economic developments, has to do a lot with needing materials and markets, as well as this debate over tariffs, because farmers were really frustrated that tariffs were protecting manufacturing at the expense of agricultural prices. And then, of course, you have these false notions of racial superiority and a thing called eugenics, which is a false science that says essentially that certain people are inferior. And so that's what you see happening around this time. The Navy, and of course, the Spanish-American War is pretty significant. But you have other things happening. Japan, Hawaii, China. Japan becomes they rapidly industrialize and become very kind of imperialistic themselves. In fact, Teddy Roosevelt will send our naval fleet all around the Pacific, and called the Great White Fleet. And you'll have the open door policy and all this kind of stuff. And so ultimately, our investment in some of these countries will lead to intervention in Mexico, Haiti, Dominican Republic, and so on. So those areas, and then this cartoon pretty much says it all about how the U.S. is kind of growing into its own, if you will. And so that's kind of imperialism in a nutshell. When you're talking about women and how women intersect with this, I think it's telling that they really don't, right? I mean, this is absolutely a policy driven by men, you can say. I mean, most of the women, when they do speak out about imperialism, are speaking out against it. Or they just don't think anything of it. So I really think that this is a masculine policy about acquiring territory and taking over, and it's all about money. I just don't think that it really intersects a whole lot with native-born American women, particularly white women. There is some concern, from some poor working-class women, immigrant women, African-American women. Do we want to have, if you have women, people that are cheap labor from other places, like, what's that going to do to my job? And most notably, the people that pay the price are going to be the women that are, whose countries are imperialized. The Philippines, for instance, Cuba, for instance, Guam, for instance. Those countries, really kind of have to deal with, the influence of another country. So I think it's important to kind of note that it's a very masculine kind of idea. But it is important because it does set the U.S. up for world involvement and world engagement, as well as it causes us to build up our Navy. And those factors are very important for moving into World War I.